I leave you, my peace I give you, Jesus says in the gospel today. These words from the Last Supper. And I don't know about you, but peace is something I could do with a little more of these days. What do you think? I mean, you just read the news. It's absolutely depressing. They should just call it bad news. The 5 o'clock bad news, the 10 p.m. bad news. I was sick last week and spent a lot of time lying on the couch on my phone reading news headlines. And, we've got war, we've got tensions between nations that are really scary. COVID-19 continues, we've got inflation, and we even have monkeypox. I mean, give me a break. We're reminded, perhaps, that, that news outlets are not charities, right? They're businesses that make money, and they profit from fear and disturbing our peace. And in light of that, and in life in general these days, I'm reminded of an essential truth, that the only path to peace is deeper trust in God. The only path to peace. Because here's the thing. We entrust ourselves to something or someone. And the degree to which we feel safe in that act of trust is the degree to which we will receive peace. Who's more worthy of that trust than the Lord? So when we actually yield in faith, and the word faith and trust really can translate the same original Greek word for faith. You see, for us, faith, we often think of faith as I give intellectual assent to abstract statements, abstract propositions. But faith in the Hebrew sense is faith as in a lived experience. It's about trust. I actually live in a way that my life reflects what it is that I believe in. And when we live in a relationship of trust with God, it will yield the fruit of peace in a way that the world cannot give. Jesus says in the gospel today, I do not give peace to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. Now, the world proposes to us that peace can be found in materialism and in so-called financial security. I found this definition of financial security on a marketing website yesterday. It said this: financial security refers to the peace of mind felt when we aren't worried about money. There you go. Now I'm wondering, who is actually immune from worrying about money? Do you know anyone who's immune from that temptation? I mean, even the top 1% who would seem to have no reason to worry about money, guess what? They worry about money. The billionaire John D. Rockefeller was once asked, how much money does it take to make a man happy? And his answer, just $1 more. You see, we constantly expand our lifestyles so that we always will feel the need for more. The more we have, the more afraid we are of losing what we have. And in spite of our relative abundance, I mean, think of our parents, think of our grandparents, how they lived. Think of how the vast majority of people around the world live. In spite of our relative abundance, we're bombarded every day by thousands of advertising messages that remind us of all the stuff we don't have. And these messages come with a subtle suggestion that having the newest thing will bring us this elusive peace. Now, today is the second weekend of our preaching series, Journey into Purpose. It's a 3-week preaching series in which we are tackling the topic of, drum roll, financial giving. Thank you, Allison. We're addressing the topic of giving. Now, so I want to say, if you're here as a visitor today, congratulations, you hit the jackpot. Or if you've just returned to church, because we don't talk about this topic all that much, but today and next week we are. Last week, we looked at the question of why. Why do we give to to the mission of the church. We made the distinction that we don't give to the church, because if you give to the church, you're putting yourself outside of the church, right? And our starting point is that we are the church. We, all of us, together. And together, we give to the mission of the church, for the mission that God has called us to accomplish. Where we give not just to pay the bills, not to get by on the bare minimum, but to be faithful to what God is calling us to do. We looked at the parish purpose statement, the new purpose statement, and the new vision statement that we believe that we're called to be, as a parish, the heart of Dartmouth. So we looked at why. This week, I'd like to look at the question of how we give. And I want to do this by looking at 5 biblical principles that can help us to actually grow in our trust of God and our peace. Now, I want to share these principles with you by telling you a little bit about my own journey in giving. And before I do this, I want to just pause, because I'm fully aware that this homily I'm giving right now is probably not going to be in your top 10 list of favorite Father James homilies. Just want to put that out there, okay? We got that? Sometimes we just got to preach what we have to preach, right? But I want to give you these principles. I'm not trying to burden anyone. I want to share these principles with you and leave it with you to work out what that means for your life. Sound good? All right. First principle is the principle of non-exclusion. What does this mean? Well, when I was young, when I first started taking church seriously, when I didn't care about church, I didn't put anything in the collection. But guess what? Even when I started caring about church, I still didn't put anything in the collection. Because for me, it was not applicable. I was a student, N.A., not applicable. Even when I was in the seminary, not applicable. I had excluded myself from giving. And besides, when I was in the seminary, I was thinking, well, I've given my whole life, and they don't pay me all that much, so I'm not putting anything in the collection. I was excluded. I was excused. In my very first week on the job as a newly minted priest, 25 years ago this week, well, maybe next week, because I took a week vacation. But Bishop Curry, who lives in the house here, many of you know him, Archbishop Curry, he was the parish priest at the cathedral, and I was his assistant. And on the first week, he met me in the hallway, and he handed me a box of envelopes. You know, the envelopes that you use to put your money in for the collection. And I asked at that point, which still is the dumbest question I've ever asked in my life. I said to him, honestly, I said, what am I supposed to do with these? And he yelled at me. He said, use them. So I started using them. And although I didn't put very much in the collection, it was actually a really big shift, because I had gone from exclusion, self-exclusion, to non-exclusion. You see, the call to support the mission, the call to give, the call to be generous involves every single one of us, even children, even students, everyone. No one is excluded. Principle number 1. Principle number 2 is the principle of stewardship. Now, when I became a parish priest for the first time, I began to hear about this concept, and I just want to share a bit about it briefly. The basic concept, and it comes from the scriptures, is that when it comes to everything that we have, the time that we have, the time that God has given us, the talents, the gifts that we have, and even our financial treasure, the principle of stewardship says this, that these gifts are not actually yours. We're not owners. We're stewards. You know the difference? We don't own this. God actually is the owner, and God has given us these treasures to be stewarded, to be, in a sense, managed, to be cared for, to be nurtured, to be grown, to be shared, to be returned, and He will seek an accounting from us. It's very much a scriptural understanding of what it means to live as a follower. And to be honest, when I first heard this message, I really struggled with it, because I had to allow it to go from my head into my heart, this idea that I don't actually own the stuff that I have. It's given to me and put into my care. So that's the second principle. The third principle is the principle of proportionality. So when I started giving, when Bishop Curry first gave me that box of envelopes, I actually didn't put all that much in, but it was something. But then I went to my first parish for the first time, and the priest who was there before me was retired, and the parish wasn't bringing in enough money to pay his salary, so he was living off his pension. Of course, I arrive, I've got a student loan and car loans and all this, and so we had no money. And so right in the very first weeks, I had to speak about this topic. And then I realized that thing that preachers deal with all the time, that you've got to practice what you preach. So if I was inviting parishioners to increase their giving, to commit to giving, I had to do the same. And every year since that time, whenever I preach on the subject, I have to respond in kind. And in doing so, I discovered this principle of proportionality. Now, this is really, really important, because in the scriptures, the value of our financial gift is in proportion to what we have. Let me say that again. The value of our financial gift is in proportion to what you have. The size of the gift is the proportion, not the amount, not the number of zeros on your check. And this can mean two different things. It can mean sometimes for people who might be tempted to think that your gift is insignificant because it's a small amount, your gift might be the greatest gift. Remember the widow who put in a few pennies? Jesus said she has given more than all these rich people, all these rich guys dropping in wads of cash. You may be giving more than you think. On the other side of the coin, you may be giving less than you think. There might be an extra zero, but in proportion, you might not be giving all that much at all. We need to do the math. And when I did the math, I realized that I wasn't actually being very generous. So I had to deal with that. Okay, principle number 4. Are you ready for number 4? All right, good. Well, that sounded enthusiastic. That was good. This is a tough one. Are you ready? Brace yourself. It's the T word. Tithing. I know, it's like we're Catholics. We don't do that. Yeah, I know. We don't. But the question is, what is God calling us to do? Because in the scriptures, this is a biblical principle. It's the principle of giving back to God 10% of our income. So think of that stewardship idea. God has given us everything. I mean, think of if someone walked up to you on the street and said, I'd like to give you $10 on one condition. And you said, what's that? That you give me $1 back. You think, that's a pretty good deal. I just have to give back $1. And that's the idea. God has given us everything and expects a tithe in return. Now, I have been tithing for 16 years. But from the day that Bishop Curry handed me that box of envelopes, it took me 9 years to start doing it. So it didn't happen overnight. It took me 9 years. And it really, a turning point was when a friend of mine challenged me. He said to me, Father James, do you tithe? And I was like, well, I maybe, kind of. And he kind of nailed me to the ground and made me commit to going back and doing the math. And I did that. I got my tax receipt out and I looked at my income and I divided it by 10 and I committed to saying that's my goal for this coming year. And a year later, I met my friend again and I told him, guess what? I've been tithing for a year. I was quite proud of myself. Then he asked me a question. He said, well, is that a real tithe, James? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, don't you get like a lot of priest perks? Like all those little hidden, invisible extras, you know, where you live and all this. And I didn't like where this conversation was going at all. I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. And so he challenged me to actually sit down and evaluate the true value of what I have, what I receive. And so I left and I went away, and guess what I did? Well, I told this story a number of years ago in a parish, and I asked that same question, and someone yelled out from the congregation, "You never went back to see your friend ever again." Well, I decided to go for it, and it was a difficult decision because it meant having to commit to giving more money away to different charities, to my parish, and it was more than I could afford, and that was the difference for me. You see, up until then, I had been giving, in a sense, safely. It was safe. I was giving what I could afford, and this was a call for me to step over a line that was quite scary. But I can tell you that after 16 years, God cannot be outdone in generosity. I know that it sounds trite to say it like this, but God is faithful. And rather than feeling that this is something that I have to do, it's a lot more fun than that. It's almost like, hey, every year I get to give away X amount of money, and I get to decide where I'm going to distribute it. And I found it to be very, very life-giving. Okay, the fifth principle is the principle of first fruits. Now, the decision to grow in my giving led me to embrace this fifth principle, which we also find in the scriptures. We hear about it first in the Bible in the story of Cain and Abel. It's throughout the scriptures, and we see it even in the life of Jesus. When Jesus was presented in the temple, it was because every firstborn, scripture says, belongs to the Lord. So if you were a farmer, the firstborn sheep, the firstborn cow, the firstborn goat had to be sacrificed to the Lord. The first one, the one that opened the womb, the firstborn son belonged to the Lord. Now, you didn't sacrifice the baby, but you went to the temple and you made a different sacrifice so that you could redeem back. That's when Jesus was presented in the temple, he was redeemed. The first fruits belong to the Lord. So if you're a farmer, the first fruits of the harvest you offer to God. And this is very much a biblical understanding, but it's one that challenges us deeply. It challenged me deeply. Because the difference is this, that for most of my life, I was giving to God from the leftovers. I was literally serving God leftovers. Because I take care of all my bills, all of my needs, and many of my wants. And then from what was left, I'd say, okay, God, you can have this. And first fruits basically says you pay the Lord first. And that's an act of faith. Because just like the farmer, who has a cow, you might say, well, Lord, can you wait till maybe the cow has like 5 babies and then I'll give you one of them? Because what if it doesn't have more? It's an act of faith. It takes us, in a sense, over a line. See, this practice will grow your faith. It will grow your trust. And faith is like anything. It's like a muscle. If you want your muscle to grow, you've got to exercise it. If you want faith to grow, you've got to step over the line from the line of what is safe. If you want to grow in faith and experience the peace that comes with it, you have to exercise faith. Okay, in conclusion, I just want to remind you that I'm sharing these principles with you today, not to be a burden to anyone, not to get anyone upset, but just to help you, to invite you to reflect, and perhaps even to break away from seeking the peace that the world offers, the security that the world offers, this peace that is elusive, the search for which is so often frustrated by fear and anxiety, fear of never having enough and anxiety of losing what we do have. You see, Jesus gives us peace, peace that is the fruit of real trust. And in a very real way, to grow in this trust is to grow in our generosity to others. Generosity that includes supporting the mission of the church and other organizations and charities, not simply because the parish or other organizations need to receive, but because we actually have a need to give.